So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the penultimate joint Heidelberg Astronomical Colloquium. This week we're coming a little bit nearer. We're going to hear more about the Milky Way, and we're very pleased that Gail Zasowski, all the way from Utah, will tell us about the view of the Milky Way from Utah. And to introduce Gail, I'll hand over to Dominika Wajselek.
Yes, so Gail, also welcome from my side. It's great to have you here. It's my pleasure to introduce Gail to you. Gail received her PhD in 2012 from the University of Virginia and was then an NSF fellow at Ohio State University and the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. After a short data science fellowship at Space Telescope Science Institute, she joined the faculty at the University of Utah as an assistant professor in 2017. And as of the end of last year, she's now an associate professor there. Gail is an expert on characterizing stellar populations and the ISM with photometry and high resolution spectroscopy. She's using very large data sets and has been developing statistical techniques to analyze these high dimensional data sets. I think we'll hear about some of that today. With the ultimate goal to use the Milky Way and nearby galaxies as archaeological laboratories to study galaxy evolution. Gail has also been involved in multiple generations of SDSS surveys for more than 15 years. She has served as the spokesperson for SDSS-V for 5 years. So she really knows the collaboration inside out. And I guess if you have any questions about SDSS, about the data itself, she said that she's more than welcome to answer any questions. So thank you, Gail, for making it all the way here from Utah for this long trip. And we're very excited about your talk and having you here. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dominika, and for the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity to come out here. I love visiting Heidelberg. This is my first trip back since the pandemic, and it's been fantastic. My first time at the university, and so it's really been fantastic to meet everyone here. Okay, I'm going to head off the first question by saying that this is not me inside the arch. This is Delicate Arch in Utah. It's about 3.5 hours from my house. But in the background here, we see the Milky Way, and so I really like this picture. Contrasting, measuring very old things close to us, measuring very old things far from us, and in particular, we have the center of the Milky Way here, which is one of the galactic environments that we can really only study in detail very close. So what I'm talking about today is how we use the Milky Way as a template for understanding other galaxies, especially in the central regions and in some of the very great. Okay, so this is where we're going. All right, so galaxies. So on the largest scales in the universe, galaxies act as the base units of the mass distribution. Right? They let us trace the otherwise invisible structure of large-scale dark matter, and they also house most of the observable phenomena that give rise to our understanding of baryonic physics, everything from AGN feedback to star and planet formation. The galaxies are not homogeneous, they're not monolithic, and they're not static. So this is the first JWST deep field showing the diversity of shapes, the heterogeneity of the shapes, and the variety of morphologies that we see in galaxies, even in a very, very, very tiny patch of the sky. Now, the baryonic matter that makes up a lot of these observable phenomena in galaxies is largely in the form of stars or gas. And so understanding the variations in these properties at the level of individual stars, small-scale stellar populations, small-scale gas clouds, is really important for understanding galaxy evolution, because it's the variations in these small-scale components that drive the variety and the evolutionary pathways of galaxies as a class. Most galaxies in the universe are very tiny, but the big galaxies are so massive that if you actually make a plot of log galaxy mass along the x-axis and fraction of stars in the universe that live in galaxies of a given mass, we find this peak here roughly close to the mass of the Milky Way. So again, there's many more small galaxies, but these bigger ones here, in particular, like the Milky Way, means that the Milky Way's baryons, our stars and gas, have evolutionary history that's relevant to understanding that of most of the baryons in the galaxy or in the universe. And understanding that evolutionary history is what I mean by galactic archaeology. I know this is a dinosaur. We should call it galactic paleontology. I wasn't on the committee when that name got decided. This is what we're stuck with. So we had the skeleton of a dinosaur. We have the Gaia CMD superimposed on the backhand side. So when paleontologists are looking to recreate the history of a dinosaur species, they very, very rarely have any sort of complete specimen from any single point in time. You've got different fragments of fossils from different individuals from different eras spanning different parts of the species evolution. When archaeologists are trying to recreate the history of a particular civilization, again, they've got little bits of different kinds of data from different parts of the region spanned by the civilization, usually from different time periods. So astronomers, we're trying to recreate the history of the Milky Way. We go into, our exploration of the different fragments of this history, fossil fragments of this history, involves going into different spatial regions of the galaxy, but also different regions of the high-dimensional phase-space information of our stars. So the positions, the ages, the motions, the chemistries, and all of these things, and use that to try to understand how the components of the galaxy came together, evolved, are still evolving with time. Galactic astronomy, I would say both in the Milky Way and in things like the local group, has gotten this massive resurgence in the last couple of decades, due in part to large numbers of fossil fragments from surveys like SDSS, from like Gaia, in the future from LSST. And so there's really been a revolution, not only in the kinds of data that we're looking at, but kind of the tools that we need to use to try to synthesize all of this information into a holistic narrative of how our galaxy evolves and then what that means for understanding how other galaxies evolve. All right, so when I talk about galactic archaeology, a lot of the tools that we use can be classified into sort of three very, very, very broad categories. So simulations of galaxies. This is a snapshot from the CLUE simulation showing only the dark matter distribution in several large halos. Simulations, of course, are invaluable if you want to follow the progression of a single system over time, which we really can't do in real life. And if you want to really understand what the complex interplay is of all of the physics that's going on in here. This is now from the illustrious simulation. Upper left, we have the starlight. The upper right-hand side, we have the gas density. Lower left is the gas temperature, and you can see these hot bubbles of black hole explosions going off. And then the bottom right, we have the heavy element fraction. You can see the colors changing as this particular clump of galaxies enriches itself in heavy elements. So these simulations span a wide range from dark matter only on the very, very largest scales, down to very complicated baryonic physics on the scales of individual galaxies, and even more finely resolved than that. But even these high-resolution baryonic simulations really don't capture variations, don't capture individual stars, don't capture very, very small gas clouds at the level that we know from observations in nearby galaxies that things do in fact vary. And they often rely on prescriptions for things like star formation that we just haven't been able to constrain observationally well enough yet to model from scratch. Sorry for the bright white. The second large category I want to talk about is extragalactic samples of galaxies. So either a small number studied in very high resolution detail spectroscopy, or many, many filters, or a much larger sample studied with photometry with some eye towards measuring mean statistical properties. This is really, really helpful because we get a time-stamped progression of properties dating from very recent times back to the early universe. But with a very, very few exceptions, most of these systems are too far away, again, to resolve individual stars or small-scale fluctuations in the ISM. And so we're left with trying to understand what information we can extract when you're integrating the light from stars and from gas over millions of stars, large chunks of the ISM. The third category, the one we're talking about now, is using the Milky Way and other galaxies in the local group, which is a much smaller sample and of a few, but with access to some unique information that you really can't get in other systems. So the low luminosity outer disk and halo, looking at the low metallicity stellar populations out there, the very bright but extraordinarily crowded populations in the center of the galaxy. You have many, many, many stellar populations tangled up together. Full phase space information for your stars, three-dimensional distributions and motions of gas and dust. These are things that just aren't accessible in other systems. Okay, so what does the Milky Way galaxy look like? Just to put some numbers for those of you who don't spend a lot of time thinking about Milky Way galaxies. This is an artist's view of a Milky Way type galaxy seen nearly edge on. We have the virial radius of our galaxy is about 250 kiloparsecs in radius, so dark matter dominated once you get to the outskirts. In the interior, about 100 kiloparsecs sort of defines the extent of the stellar halo. So a huge fraction of the baryonic volume of the Milky Way, but really only contains a tiny fraction of the stars. I think 1% there might actually be a little bit generous. Deep inside the halo, we have the stellar disk of the galaxy, which contains the vast majority of the stars, extends 15 to 20 kiloparsecs in radius, so much, much, much smaller in volume, a half to 1 kiloparsec in height. So axis ratio, very, very, very thin, very, very flat. I used to use laser discs as sort of the visual analogy, and then that stopped making sense to students. But if you know what a laser disc is, it's about that kind of axis ratio. Intermixed with the stars is the interstellar medium, contains gas in various phases as well as dust. It's a little bit more confined than the most extended stellar populations, about half a kiloparsec in scale height, and the gas proportion at least extends out quite a bit further than the stars. And then in the very innermost 3.5 kiloparsecs or so, we have the bar bulge complex, which could be an entire talk in and of itself. So very, very, very tiny volume, but actually contains just under a quarter of the galaxy's entire stars. So a huge range of densities across the galaxy. All right, so kind of data that we're looking at. So just as an overview of the data sets I'll be showing. This is an artist view of the Milky Way seen face on. The sun is sort of here on this side. And then if we overplot the density of stars that had been observed by the Apogee survey, which is a spectroscopic survey that operated during SDSS-3 and 4, we see sort of where the stars in the galaxy lie. So there's obviously a lot more stars near the sun. This is a log scaling. So most of the stars are concentrated on our side of the galaxy. From these data, we get things like velocities, line of sight velocities of the stars, chemical abundances, enough information to get distances, to get ages, the presence or absence of companions, stellar or substellar. And so even though most of these stars are close to us, the fact that we have this information for stars over such a huge fraction of the galactic disk is really striking. A few decades ago, a stellar sample that had this kind of information would have numbered hundreds in size and all very, very close to the sun. So we're really, really, and then maybe a couple of very dedicated sight lines towards the bulge. So really expanding not only the quantity of data, but also like the kinds of data and the kinds of questions that we can ask with that data. When we're looking at other galaxies, my group, there's many extragalactic samples out there. My group in particular has been looking using information from the MANGA survey, which is a galactic IFU survey that also operated during SDSS-4, which laid out several dozen fibers across the face of these galaxies. And so dealing with integrated stellar and gas measurements, so not resolving individual stars or small scale gas clouds, but by tiling these fibers across the surface of the galaxy, you're able to get these mean abundances at more than one position inside the galaxy, and then try to understand how these mean properties correlate with like the morphological features, the spiral arms and bar structure of the galaxy. And just as a historical note, if any of you have ever looked at an SDSS spectrum that was taken before 2022, that spectrum was taken with an optical fiber that was hand plugged into a metal plate by a dedicated team of pluggers at APO and at the Duke telescope. They're very fast. This video is sped up a little bit, but not as much as you might think. I visited there once and I asked if I could plug a plate, and of course they're like, yes, of course you can do the job. And then they just laughed at me and made me stop because I was very slow and very bad at it. But seriously, all of the millions of SDSS spectra that have been taken, including with the original survey and Boston, all that, hand-plugged fibers. Okay, so let's start our tour of the science now. So we'll start here in the Milky Way. So typical Milky Way observation, you're able to resolve an individual star, sort of if galaxies are the base units of matter distribution on very large scales, stars are kind of the atoms of galaxies. And so we're interested in asking questions about how can we learn things from individual stars, to ask about how the Milky Way enriched itself, when did stars fall in, where did the other stars come from, I'm very interested in questions of chemistry. How did stellar debris build our periodic table at different parts of the galaxy? Let's talk about the chemistry. So I'm going to be showing this sort of plane quite a bit in here, so I want to walk through what these axes mean. So on the x-axis, we have metallicity. For those of you who are used to thinking of bracket metallicity notation, for everyone else, it's just mean heavy element abundance. The sun is here at 0 for reasons. Along the y-axis here, we have the ratio of alpha elements, so the series of light elements whose production is dominated by explosions of massive stars, the ratio of those alpha elements to iron. So not a total heavy element abundance, but looking at the ratio of these particular abundances. So if we think about a single star or single star cluster or some monoabundance homogeneous population that lives in a single space on this diagram. In a very simple chemical evolution model where you don't have anything complicated or crazy going on, if you start forming stars at some particular point in time, those stars tend to start with very low metallicity and enhanced alpha abundances because each new star is born from material that has been enriched primarily by core collapse supernovae, which tend to be very rich in alpha elements. As time goes on, eventually your thermonuclear supernovae begin to go off. These produce a huge amount of iron. And so you're continuing to enrich an overall metallicity, but your alpha to iron ratio drops until you reach some equilibrium abundance that's determined by a wide range of factors. But basically, your increase in metallicity begins to slow down and you settle into some equilibrium alpha abundance. And so even this very simple toy model here can give us, like the location of stars in this diagram gives us information on the efficiency of star formation at different times, the mean metal enhancement over time. Of course, the universe is significantly more complicated. So this plot is deliberately messy and confusing. I just put on here a couple of the parameters that go into a star formation event, different aspects of a star formation event that can affect the trajectory of stars along this line as a function of time. So outflow rates change your equilibrium abundances. If you're adding gas in, that can move stars around, and all of this. And understanding which events have influenced which other events, which stars have influenced which other stars is really complicated. What you really want to actually know is which way time flows in this particular messy space. So what you really want is the ages of stars in here to be able to untangle which stars influence which other stars, which direction, which of these aspects of the star formation history has been influencing which stars. Now, the ages of stars is a long-standing, very, very, very difficult problem to answer. Age dating humans is relatively easy. Like most of us could look at another person and guesstimate within a few years or a decade or two how old that person is. This is because humans tend to age in very similar ways, at the same rate. There's certain like physical markers of aging that most of us undergo. And this is just not true for stars. So very supermassive stars, our protostars form very quickly, begin to evolve before their lower mass siblings even hit the main sequence, become blue supergiants and may explode and turn into a black hole. Super light stars just kind of sit there glowing faintly for many, many, many times the age of the universe. So not only does the length of time spent in each phase depend on the mass, which usually we don't know, but also which phases they go through. A star like the sun will kind of look like the sun for about 10 billion years, and it's really hard to tell where in that 10 billion year span a star like the sun happens to be sitting. So historically, this has been extraordinarily difficult. There's been a lot of work recently, especially with astroseismology, which is kind of one of the best ways now to measure masses and then ages of individual stars. In order to make that practical with sort of the industrial scale stellar surveys that we have now, we need to really understand the connection between the astroseismic signature or the age tracers that we see in our very expensive astroseismic data, and then other bits of information that we have from much, much larger samples of stars in order to measure ages for a practically large number of objects. So the first project that I'll be talking about today is measuring ages for stars in the very center of the Milky Way, and then understanding kind of what that tells us about the star formation history in the crowded inner region of the galaxy. So the important point here is that there is, and I won't go into the details of this, but there is a relationship between age, shown by the color here, the C to N ratio in the star's outer atmosphere, in the photosphere of the star, again, for reasons that depends on the mass of the star and therefore related to the age, and the metallicity. And it's not that complicated a relationship, but it's not entirely linear in any direction anyway. So there's a variety of techniques that you can do to learn this relationship from stars that have very expensive astroseismic measurements or very, very detailed ages from other means, and then use that to to infer ages for other stars that you have these relatively cheap metallicity and carbon to nitrogen abundances for. And so I was working with a postdoc at the University of Utah, who's now at Space Telescope, Sten Hasselquist, who did this for tens of thousands of stars in the galactic bulge, very high luminosity stars that for various reasons hadn't really been done before. And so that gave us a new perspective on what the age distribution looks like in the very center of our galaxy. So this plot is showing we're now looking at the center of the galaxy face on, very different perspective from what we actually have in real life. The sun is right here at -8,0. We're looking at the center of the galaxy at the bar seen almost end on. This dashed line indicates the approximate position of the bar. The color scaling looks better on my computer, but hopefully you think I'm not totally making this up when I say so. The color of the pixels indicates the median age in each bin. Yellow and orange are very old. Black is relatively young. And we see that there is an enhancement that the center of the galaxy overall is larger than the disk, and there's actually an asymmetric enhancement that seems to follow the bar. So the barred regions of the bulge seem older than the non-barred regions of the bulge. We can look at the same perspective now for different heights above the galactic plane. Like once you have enough stars, you can begin slicing and dicing things in all kinds of different dimensions. So this is in the plane of the galaxy. As you move here, these bottom cartoons show the approximate layer that we're looking at here in blue. As we go a little bit higher out of the galaxy, things get on average older and also homogeneously older. As you go up higher and higher and higher, this pattern really continues. But we also have chemistry. So we can now start looking more at the relationship between ages and chemistry and position. So this is that exact same iron to alpha, magnesiums and alpha elements. This is the exact same plane I was showing earlier, where each of these dots here represents a bunch of stars at that position. It's just a way of pixelizing this plane. And the color here indicates the median age of stars with that chemistry at these different locations in the bulge. So purple things here are very old. Blue things here are still old, but relatively younger. We see that again, in the outer bulge, you had homogeneously old things. And in the plane, where you saw that there were things that were a little bit younger, most of those younger stars are concentrated here at very high metallicity, at superstellar metallicities. We can even do things like measuring the age spreads in here. So this is you can think of this as the allowable age spread after you're taking into account all of the significant uncertainties. So black points here are those that are consistent with a single age. Yellow points are those that seem to have a genuine age spread. So in the outer bulge, where you have things that are old, they're also uniformly old. In the inner galaxy, you have a wider range of ages, some things that are younger, and this is where you also seem to find monoabundance populations that do seem to have a genuine age spread, although not necessarily even at the highest metallicities here. The youngest things seem to be closer to being mono-age. So all of these things together are telling us something about the star formation history of the bulge. You can also fold in kinematics. I won't show you any plots. I'll just tell you that these younger stars here, these mono-age younger stars, tend to also have more disk-like rotation and tend to be confined to a particular range and radius. So this is consistent with whatever the star formation was that gave rise to these stars happening not in sort of the isotropic bulge shape or even the bar shape, but in some disky shape up to a couple gigayears ago. Sorry, I keep forgetting to take all these words down. The important things are in purple. Most stars in the inner galaxy formed 8 to 10 gigayears ago, and so it's really interesting to think about star formation when the stars formed versus when things like the bar formed. The structure of formation is very different from the star formation of the stars that now make up that structure. The enrichment happened fastest in the plane, even though it happened longest in the plane, and there was still some sort of planey, disky structure that star formation was going until possibly as recently as 2 gigayears ago. And this is really nice because we can actually look and see, and we see similar morphological structures with similar colors indicating young ages in external galaxies and in these high resolution simulations, suggesting that this metal-rich disk that had star formation somehow persisting until relatively recently is not confined to our Milky Way. Okay, so then going back to this confuse a plot here. So as mentioned, so having ages and being able to tag ages onto this plot is really valuable, especially when we're thinking about doing chemical evolution modeling and looking to see how the patterns that we see here, how these different aspects of star formation and chemical enrichment can happen at different places in the galaxy itself. So I'm going to walk through another example of that. Okay, so 2 plots here showing the exact same thing. On the x-axis in both is metallicity. I know the labels are different letters, but it means metallicity. The y-axis is alpha elements. These are all stars within a few kiloparsecs of the sun, so relatively close to the solar neighborhood. And in both of them, the color bar indicates the mean age of the stars at a given chemistry. Now, if we blink back to that simple chemical model earlier, remember I said that in a simple chemical evolution model, you start up here in the upper left and you move down to the lower right over time. And so you expect old things to be here, middle-aged things to be here, and youngest things to be here. When we look in the solar neighborhood, we do, in fact, we do see old things here, But then the next oldest things tend to be here, and the youngest things tend to be down here. And you see this is seen in a huge number of data sets with totally independent age techniques. This is a well understood pattern. So this tells us right away, just even looking at these data, tells us that the chemical enrichment near the Milky Way, near the sun and the Milky Way is not simple. You need to invoke multiple star formation events, you need to invoke accretion of gas and or some complicated radial migration patterns being set up, which depend on, whatever your preferred history of the stellar arms and the bar are. So this was Jean-Hui Levan was a postdoc in Utah, actually was then here in Heidelberg at MPIA for a couple of years. He's now a faculty member in China. And so he was using some of these new constraints that we had with stellar chemistry, stellar ages, and having enough stars to actually trust that you had a representative sample of survey selection function corrected densities to fit a numerical enrichment model. So we did this in sort of 3 rough radial zones. And then the challenge is then putting together the results of your fitting code with whatever parameters you've chosen into your code, putting it into a narrative of galaxy evolution. So let's start here in the inner disk. So on the left-hand side here, this is again the artist representation of the Milky Way, and now the pink circle indicates the approximate radial range that we're looking at. On the right-hand side, again, metallicity on the x-axis, alpha abundance on the y-axis, and then we're going to show in blue here is now the density of stars observed with apogee, corrected for the survey selection function. By which I mean we're trying to account for all of the stars that we didn't observe, so that we understand how many stars the galaxy actually has in these pixels, unfiltered through where apogee chose to look and how long it chose to look at certain places. So this particular model, I guess I'll spare you the details of this particular model. It allows for accretion of fresh gas, a secondary star formation rate, which has been done for decades now. People are very comfortable with this idea. But one of the features that's been really difficult to fit has been actually the drop in density between this blue blob and this blue blob. More stars here, very few stars here, more stars there. And that's actually been really, really difficult to reproduce that lack of stars, like the speed by which you go from here to here. So that was one of the things that we were really trying to go after. We also have ages for all of these stars. So that really gives us constraints on that exhibitive constraint. I don't have it shown here, but how the model has to proceed over time. So in essence, we find the sequence. We had some very early starburst event that produced a lot of these stars up here, relatively rapid quenching periods. So now the arrows indicate the flow of time. That gives us a very a dearth of stars here. Slow evolution, we reach some pseudo equilibrium abundance at this point. Then there's a secondary an accretion of relatively fresh gas that dilutes metallicity of your ISM and some secondary starburst. So you get enhanced in alpha abundance a little bit because you get some more core collapse supernovae going off, and then it proceeds along a similar track. Great. We apply that same framework to the outer disk, find a very similar sequence of events, but with a much larger fraction of the mass formed in this slow evolution and accretion and secondary burst. And certainly there are stars here that formed further into the galaxy and have migrated outwards. But this is the average star formation history of the stars in this part of the galaxy. It doesn't, there are some stars here. It's not totally white. And then if we turn to the inner galaxy, again, a very similar sequence of events, except you don't actually see evidence for this accretion and secondary starburst, right? This one actually looks significantly more like that simple toy chemical evolution model that I showed earlier. The 2 different colors of lines here are just 2 different supernova yield tables, so that's not super important, but you can explain most of this with a relatively simple single starburst followed by bisecular evolution. And so putting it all together into a single picture, so on the left-hand side, I'm going to show just some cartoon images, trying to put this, the set of best fitting model parameters and turn that into a narrative. On the right-hand side is showing for the stars in the solar neighborhood, the phase of evolution that I'm talking about. And then in the bottom panel here, this is cosmic time along the x-axis. Present day is on the far right, and then star formation rate on the y-axis. So we start out with a very high intensity, widespread, thick starburst. By thick, I mean vertically extended. So a very compact, blobby proto-Milky Way in the early universe. Most of the disk quenches relatively rapidly over a fairly short period of time. So we make very few stars that have the abundance of what the ISM was at that point. And then you have slow evolution primarily in the midplane. You have very low star formation rates in the outer disk. Most of the star formation is happening in the inner disk. the star formation rate is slowly decreasing over time. You reach equilibrium abundances that depend on what the early enrichment history was at some point, and a little bit on the galaxy potential at that point. But this is where your metal-rich stars form. And then you have some accretion, you have some secondary starburst, much lower intensity than the first. But this is primarily affecting your outer disk. You have very little evidence for that in the innermost galaxy. Okay, so putting this all together. This kind of also highlights why the value of having these absolute ages, because if we only have relative ages, in a sense, we can compare these lines against each other. But if you want to try to understand how might these accretion events be connected to, say, passages of the Sagittarius dwarf galaxy or the Gaia-Enceladus merger, you really need absolute ages that allow you to connect the events that your model seems to ask for to other things that we know happen in the Milky Way that aren't included in these kinds of chemical evolution models. So that's been, I think this has been a really cool way to approach tying all of these different lines of evidence together to understand what's happened in our galaxy and what can happen in galaxies at large. One thing that's really cool is that once you have enough stars, you kind of can get away from even using models and still measure things about our galaxy. So this is also Jean Hui's work. So this is the metallicity profile of the Milky Way in a light-weighted sense. So most metallicity profiles that people have done in the past are sort of number density weighted by the number of stars in your sample. In this case, we had enough stars that we felt that once we corrected for the survey selection function, we actually had a representative sample of what stars towards the inner galaxy or towards the whole disk of the galaxy looked like. So this is radius from the center of the galaxy along the x-axis. The sun is here around 8. And on the y-axis, we have the light-weighted metallicity of the stars. So this is pretty close to what you would measure in an external galaxy, where what you have is the light-weighted spectrum. And so the total profile that we see actually is in the gray points here, actually has this weird bent shape, which is not typical. We don't see this in a lot of other galaxies. It's not unseen, and there might be some issues with resolution, but it's not common. But it turns out that because we're doing this in our galaxy, we can actually break down and understand what the contributions are of different populations to giving us this profile. So it turns out that if you look at, the colored bands here indicate what are the light-weighted metallicity profiles in stars in different age bins. So 0 to 4 are, I hate using the word young because 4 gigayears is not young, but anyway, your youngest bin here and your green bin here, and then your oldest stars here in this brown. And all of them have monotonic to flat profiles, which is kind of what you would expect from simple galaxy evolution principles. The fact that we get a total broken profile here comes from the fact that you've got just different flux contributions from stars of different ages in different parts of the galaxy. And so individually, all of these make sense. When you put them together, you get a picture that looks more complicated, that you could invoke some kind of complicated outflows or mixing scenarios to explain this. Or because we have access to the individual stars, we can infer that this is actually happening just from the mixture of age, from the age gradients inside the galaxy, rather from some complicated external process. Kind of similar work, so looking at spatial density profiles of star populations. So this is work by Julie Immig, who's also at Space Telescope. So binning up all the stars in the apogee sample by their metallicity and by their ages, by their alpha abundances, and then looking at their spatial density profiles across the entire galaxy. Again, having large numbers of stars here is really important. And I'll jump ahead and show the results. So in this case, we can do things like measuring the stellar mass accumulated in the Milky Way as a function of look-back times. We can watch the growth of the Milky Way's mass. We can watch the growth of the high and low alpha disk separately. We can do things like looking at the mass-weighted metallicity distribution function of the Milky Way at different redshifts. So very early in the universe, metallicities were dominated by the metal poor thick disk, and then you've got a lot of contribution from the bulge, which, even though very, very old, got to high metallicities very, very early on. More recently, most of the star formation has been happening at the much more metal-rich end. And I just want to emphasize here that I just think this is super, super cool, because in contrast to what I was showing earlier, this doesn't assume any kind of star formation history or parameterized enrichment model or anything, whatever. This is just quote unquote direct measurements that we have, because we know what the stars are we have in our galaxy, what they're made out of, and when they formed. We can look back in time that way. Okay. All right, so zoom out the next level. So that's great. The Milky Way is a fantastic place, but anyone can tell you, My husband's an X-ray astronomer. He works with very small samples, and even he would say that N of 1 is a bad size sample to have. You want things that are more than that. So we can look then to other galaxies. And one of the questions, of course, if you want to use the Milky Way to understand other systems, we need to know how typical the Milky Way is. How universal are these processes that we measure in our own galaxy? Are they something that are they weird? Are they rare? How much should we be including them in our simulations? So I'm going to show a little bit of work we've been doing in M31, the nearest large Milky Way-like galaxy to us. Okay, so we've looked at, I showed this plot here on the left earlier. This is metallicity versus alpha abundance, colored here by age. There are also connections. So there's clear patterns here between chemistry and age. On the right-hand plot, it's the exact same plane, except now the pixels are colored by velocity dispersion. So there's connections between metallicity, age, and kinematics, in the sense that these low metallicity, high alpha stars tend to have higher ages, larger ages, and higher velocity dispersion. And on average, these high metallicity, low alpha stars are younger and have lower velocity dispersion. There's some, and this is not strict, there are stars that are exceptions to all of these patterns, but in general, we do see this. The patterns do change with radius in the galaxy. And this has given rise to a lot of theories about the ways in which stars can be rearranged in galaxies, lots of different simulations on how you can get this particular pattern. And so the question is, how common is this pattern? Like, how much should we be using this? Trying to understand galaxies that we see, how much should we be tuning our simulations to reproduce the patterns that we see in the Milky Way? That's fuzzy. So we have we have data of our nearest Milky Way-like neighbor, M31, the Andromeda galaxy. We have about 1,000 high-resolution infrared spectra, again, taken with apogee, spread across the disk of M31. So apogee is primarily a stellar survey, but they let us point it at M31 for some reason. And so we have a whole bunch of integrated light spectroscopy across here. It's in the infrared, so it's much less sensitive to the highly visible dust lanes that we see here. So we're really tracing the mass distribution of the older stellar populations. And this is work that's being led by Ben Gibson, who's a PhD student working with me. So the first thing that we did was just make sure that we could recover what we expect by fitting for the average population in these bins. On the right-hand side here, this is, again, for all of these fiber positions in the inner, this goes out to about 5 or 6 kiloparsecs inside M31. We can measure the rotation curve. We see what we expect. We can measure the dispersion profile. Well, we see what we expect. We can measure the total metallicity. We see a negative metallicity gradient consistent with what we see, consistent with what we expect to see. Positive metallicity gradient. Metal poor in the bowl is more metal rich in the disk. We see alpha abundance patterns may or may not be correlated with the position of the bar, and so on. So all of this was great. But what we were super excited about, and this is active work in progress, is actually trying to fit for 2 populations. So the figure that I showed earlier, so if I look at this map of chemistry, alpha abundance, and then velocity dispersions here, these are all stars that are at the same position in the galaxy. In theory, this could all be stars that all fall within one of our fiber apertures if aliens outside of our galaxy were looking at the Milky Way. And what you would measure for your mean population, you would measure some mean metallicity, some mean age, some mean dispersion. But you think back to the plots I was showing earlier with the density, this is actually where we actually have very few stars kind of in the middle here. So these mean values that you measure might not actually be representative of any of the populations that are there. And so we're really interested in trying to understand how far can we actually push these data to fit multiple populations with different chemistries and different kinematics, and trying to recover at least the bimodal distribution that we see in many places in the Milky Way. And so some very preliminary results, but I'm super excited. So this is now for a handful of fibers at the very center of the galaxy. This is velocity, this is dispersion, this is metallicity. We do find in these fibers that there is a significant component. One of these components comes out to be consistently slowly rotating, have high dispersion, has lower metallicity. So maybe analogous to our bulge. And then we also, their secondary population turns out to have a higher rotation, lower velocity dispersion, and higher metallicity, which is actually analogous to stars that we see in our bar. Again, stars that are in our bar co-located with stars that are in the quote unquote bulge, but that have very different, have distinct chemistries and orbits, which give rise to different kinematical patterns. So work on this is ongoing, but these preliminary results are super encouraging. I'm very excited by them. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip talking about galaxy analogs, although I'm super happy to talk if anyone has questions and wants to talk about that later. Let me give you the punchline. The Milky Way is a little bit of a weirdo in terms of its size, maybe, although I think there's some more recent work that argues that may not be the case, or that it's a bit more complicated. We argue that scale length, that size of the galaxy actually contains quite a bit of information about the outflow and accretion history. You know what, sorry, I'm gonna skip this. Happy to talk about this with anyone later, but I wanna make sure that I get to my takeaways again. And then I wanna talk about SDSS-V, just here in the last minute or two. So those of you at the University of Heidelberg, you are full members of SDSS. So all of the data and all of the science that I'm showing, you have 100% access to. Those of you at MPIA, same story. I don't get to say that at a lot of places that I give talks at. So this is very exciting. So for those of you who have not yet dived into the Sloan data or didn't know that you had access to it, it is a dual hemisphere survey. It does not include the local volume mapper north yet. If anyone has a couple extra $1 million laying around and wants to make that happen, talk to me. But it is high resolution infrared spectroscopy of the entire sky, medium resolution optical spectroscopy of the entire sky, and super fancy IFU optical spectroscopy of the southern sky. Okay, so black holes are the most efficient producers of energy in the universe. They have a huge impact on their galaxies, on the surrounding IGM, and essentially on the evolution of the universe as a whole. So understanding how black holes grow and change over time, how they've shaped galaxy evolution over time, requires having a very large sample of black holes and a very large sample of black holes spanning a wide range of time and a wide range of masses. And so one component of Sloan 5 is called the black hole mapper, and it is taking optical spectroscopy of a very, very, very large number of black holes. It's going to be measuring black holes, going to produce the largest sample of reverberation mapping based masses and disk sizes over billions of years. So looking at the evolution of the black hole mass function over time. It's doing a huge sample follow-up of the Rosetta satellite, so probing not only AGN, but also galaxy clusters, even some stars in the Milky Way. They're not going to put them out of their sample. They're going to look at some of the flare stars that Rosetta identifies, and looking at black hole variability. So when you combine the Sloan 5 spectra with spectra from 2 decades of SDSS observations, you're really going to be able to probe variability on time scales and then therefore size scales spanning from days long, hours long, even in some cases up to decades. So really getting a handle on what's driving some of this very complicated and not really understood variability in black holes. The local volume mapper that I know many people here are actively involved in. This is an IFU survey of a huge fraction of the southern plane, looking at star formation regions and supernova remnants and all kinds of very cool things in the Milky Way. Got just under 2,000, like 1,800 fibers all bundled together. By comparison, this is the bundle sizes from the MANGA survey. And I really love this bottom graphic here for highlighting that sometimes finer isn't just finer, but it's actually scientifically better. So this is showing the same image at different spatial resolutions. And then the bottom panel is just a zoom in of one of these small pixels here. And what's interesting, and every pixel here in an IFU represents a spectrum. So you have information about the velocities, the chemistries, and so on of all of the gas in that pixel. And one thing that's really striking is that it's not only, as you go to finer and finer and finer resolution, and here on the right-hand side is representative of some of the finer resolutions observations that we'll actually get in the Milky Way. I'll just say that again, every single pixel in one of these right-hand pictures will have a spectrum of, which is crazy. But not only do you get more pixels, but you're actually able to resolve features, shocks and filaments that are really important for understanding energy exchange in the ISM that you just simply do not have any access to here on the right-hand side. So fundamentally, you can do different kinds of physics and understand different aspects of the energy exchange between stars in the ISM that you just cannot do with lower resolution stuff. This is a recent picture from the LVM. Again, you've got a spectrum here at almost every location in here. This is Catherine sent this to me just the other day. And it's just, I mean, it's beautiful. I think you can agree it's just stunning. But then scientifically, just the promise that this is going to have for being able to understand how you get from gas into stars and how stars feed back into the gas and how all of that evolves over time is just incredible. And then the third component is the Milky Way mapper. This is the one that I'm most involved in, that I'm most excited about. This is going to be getting apogee spectra, apogee quality spectra of more than 5 million stars. We're hoping for 6 million. We'll see how that goes. So just as comparison, that to convince you that this is a usefully large number. On the left-hand side is the distribution of the apogee survey. It's actually a little bit outdated. It has more than this now. But it's still true that the density sampling of apogee is largely driven by the survey, not by the density of stars in the galaxy. Simulations with the Milky Way mapper are on the right-hand side here. This is the density of the final sample. And you see you do have that this looks more like the galaxy. You're actually seeing the stars where they are, not just the stars that are closer to the sun. And not only is it just, and it's not just any stars that we're seeing, like it says any stars that we're seeing stars across the whole HR diagram. So this is, again, the Gaia CMD, just with some rough boxes. It's a graphic from Jennifer Johnson. Rough boxes outlining different components of the Milky Way Mapper survey, targeting different parts of the CMD that are useful for different kinds of stellar and stellar system physics. So huge numbers of red giant stars, huge numbers of very luminous massive stars, all the stars that are close to the sun down to some very low mass limit, a big sample of stars that we know have planets, a big sample of stars that we know don't have planets. It's really important to do both of those. Huge number of white dwarfs, compact binaries, huge bunch of other things that are super useful for stellar physics and for understanding, again, those base units of the matter distribution inside of galaxies. So this is going to be awesome. Now, one question that I often get asked, largely by funding agencies, is why do you need so many stars? And why do you need to see all of the stars? Why do you need 5 million stars? So why does dense sampling matter? So the graphic is by John Bird. I love this one. Let's say we have two models of how a particular elemental abundance could be distributed in the Milky Way. And we sample it at the current resolution, current angular density that we have for large angular surveys like apogee. And this is what this looks like. Can anyone tell me what these are two American American paintings sampled at the density, a representative density of current large scale surveys. Can anyone tell me what these paintings are? Can anyone tell that they're different? Good. Okay. So we can tell that they're different, but the full details aren't revealed until we go to the kinds of densities that Sloan 5 is going to get in the star. So we have Mark Rothko's orange and yellow on the left and Jean-Michel Basquiat on the right. So if I'm going back and forth, we can tell that they're different. A lot of the details are hidden. This is now doing the same simulation, but now using the kind of density sampling that we're going to get in Sloan 5. Now, if the Milky Way looks like the Rothko, then maybe the lower density sampling is actually fine. Like you can see large scale patterns, you're not really missing much. But everything that we learn about our galaxy is pointing to it being a lot more like the Basquiat. You've got stochasticity, you've got small scale structure that happens spatially, that happens temporally, which gets baked in spatially. And so if you really want to understand what's actually happening in our galaxy, you need this really high density sampling in order to see the coherent patterns that are happening at a huge range of scales. The kinds of questions that we're asking about our galaxy now, not only would we not have had the answers for 50 or 100 years ago, we wouldn't even been able to ask the question. And I imagine that in another 50 or 100 years, we'll be trying to answer questions that we can't even envision today. And so trying to get these very large surveys and trying to have all of that data in hand so that we can address those questions when the time comes is super important. So pushing the envelope as far as we can with the technology that we have. I'll finish up with that. And I have to do plugs. So I want to show off my research group because they are a fantastic group of people at the U. And also if there's any students in the audience who want to come do astronomy research in one of the prettiest places on the globe, in my heavily biased opinion, we have PhD and master's programs in a huge range of physics and astrophysics. And this is about 3 hours from our university. So, all right, thanks again for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Gail. This is a fascinating insight into this intricate piecing together of what is a real puzzle with still a lot of missing pieces. But I mean, obviously, you're making great progress in putting more pieces on the board and also deciphering what it means. So first of all, questions from the floor. And if there are questions from online, please type in or put your hand up.
Thank you. Can you comment on the selection of the Milky Way mapper stars? So, for example, do you include kinematic criteria, and how well is the selection function understood?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it varies by which category we're talking about. The largest bin by far is what's called this galactic genesis, which is basically just all of these red giant stars. Maintaining a simple selection function was like priority 0 in the listing. So essentially, actually changed recently, but it's the underlying principle is all of the bright red stars. Essentially, originally it was actually going to be all of the bright red stars that Gaia isn't going to get good RVS spectra for, and that's actually been relaxed a little bit because we wanted to get the metal poor stuff. So I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but it's basically a magnitude cut and maybe a couple of things, but not kinematics.
Okay, Norbert's nodding. Next question, just looking around. There's Ralph Hessen.
Very nice, cool results. I'm wondering about your Andromeda project, and I'm also wondering about LVM, which points at probably a few nearby galaxies, including LMC, SMC. Wouldn't you use these spectra to do similar studies?
Yes, unfortunately, LVM is currently only in the southern hemisphere. If we are able to put one in the north, that will be a extremely high priority target.
Sure, for Andromeda, but for, let's say, the Large Magellanic Clouds and some of the other galaxies that will be on the target list, this should be possible, right?
Yeah, we haven't. Yes, I think you're right. Actually, I'm going to defer to people in the LVM audience because I don't know 100% sure of what the depth, because most of what I think LVM is going after are like the emission lines. So I'm not sure how deep they're going to go in their ability to measure the details of the stellar continuum. Because a lot of, I think what we're finding, a lot of the reason we're pulling out, sorry, just pull this up.
But in principle, one should be able to go very deep in the LMC SMC system, right?
Yeah,
and you will have fantastic coverage.
Yeah, I think this is so actually Ben's been working on packaging up all of his code into a package that could be applied to any integrated light spectrum, for sure.
But I think no one in the consortium is looking into this type of questions. So I think this is an open field.
We're hoping that it takes off.
In the Milky Way, there are like many absorption features from stars in the mapper from the Magellanic Cloud.
Okay,
so I believe that the spectra is pretty deep in those regions. So it's very promising in the light of these results. So my question was more on the Milky Way mapper. So when you talk about the alpha elements, you mean other alpha elements you are measuring and you are using to make all these plots?
For Milky Mapper? Yeah, so these are apogee spectra. So there are 20 to 25 species that fall within apogee wavelength range. Which ones you measure will depend a little bit on the signal to noise. But I think at the target signal to noise of the galactic genesis, I think we're expecting 15 to 20 of those elements, including alpha elements, iron peak elements. The neutron capture ones are a little bit harder. Those might take some more.
Is it possible just to download those abundances?
Yes.
Well, that's great.
I can show you how to do it.
Yeah, thank you, Gail. This is really excellent stuff. I had a question also on the Milky Way mapper and specifically towards the galactic center. Like how many stars towards the galactic center will you get? Because it's pretty, Gaia is pretty blind there. So will you still, and you're in the near infrared, right? So you can fill in some of that.
Yes. So it's basically, I have an image that I can show you that'd be very impressive. That looks like an image of the Milky Way, but it's just the target density of stars, essentially. But yeah, it's not avoiding the midplane. It can go all the way through the bulge. I mean, crowding, I guess, is a little bit, when you get to like the very, very densest regions, crowding might be an issue, but Apogee was targeting things in globular clusters, like with the metal plates, and we didn't see much evidence of crowding contamination.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the hall. There's one, yes. Fabian Schneider.
Well, thank you very much. I have a question on this also Milky Way mapper survey. How many epochs are planned? Is it just single epoch? Do you have strategies for multi-epoch observations?
Yeah, so that depends a lot on which group we're talking about here. So again, Galactic Genesis will be one for them between 1 and a few dozen, depending on which targeting reason you're looking for. Is there a particular range that you're interested in?
Well, I would be primarily interested in the young galaxy, sort of in the massive stars, because you hardly find any massive star that is not with at least one companion. So if you just take a single epoch spectrum of such a star, it's kind of, well,
right.
You don't know what you have unless you have a multi-epochs actually survey there.
I think those do have more. There was a table in the first data release paper that I'm now forgetting the number, but it actually has all of these different cartons and then the number of epochs expected for them, which is the reference for that is this Almeida et al. 2023, if you want to look up that table.
Okay, then just looking onto the online, I don't see any questions, nothing there, Yifeng? No, okay. Then I think we'll slowly wrap up. Before we thank Gail, I have just 3 announcements to make. Right, so let's just now thank once again Gail for this very interesting and insightful talk. And obviously there's a big connection between Gail and the work here in Heidelberg here. And we look forward very much to hearing what's going to happen in the future, and good luck with everything. And thank you very much for this great colloquium.